Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 127 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Erin Browning for this episode, and right now it's Children's Grief Awareness Month, and we have a little different topic for you this week. We are talking about being a step-parent who has grieving stepkids when your spouse or their parent has died. And Erin is very thoughtful on this topic because she has seen it from both sides. Her dad died when she was young and was married to her stepmother, and she is now a stepmother herself to a grieving teen after her partner died. So before we jump into my discussion with Erin, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. So first of all, I am working right now on going through all of these submissions I've received for Widowed Parents Unite. I've gotten some really great tips and reflections from some of our fellow widowed parents out there, and I can't wait to start sharing some of them with you this month, actually, on social media, even before the book comes out next year. So keep a lookout for that. And now you can find Widowed Parents Unite on Goodreads, so be sure to go over there and add it to your I Want to Read This Book shelf so that you'll get updates and find out when it's published. And speaking of updates, stay tuned for the cover reveal very soon here. So be sure to add it to your Want to Read shelf so that you'll be among the first to see that. And speaking of Goodreads, I've got a giveaway going on over there right now for 100 copies of Future Widow. I do this every November for Children's Grief Awareness Month, and so the giveaway ends on the 17th, and after that, 100 winners will have the book automatically show up on their Kindles. So you can get right to the giveaway on the Goodreads site if you go to jennylisk.com/Goodreads. So that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Erin Browning. Erin is a speech-language pathologist, and she's also a breathwork facilitator and health counselor. And she's here today because she lost her partner suddenly and is a step-parent to his teenage son. So Erin is joining us today from New England. Erin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. And, I hear from listeners with what you might call kind of questions about a different angle on the widowed parenting situation. And what do I mean by that? It could be, a case where grandparents are raising grieving children because the parents have died and the grandparents are stepping into the parent role. It could be a case of an ex-spouse whose children are now grieving because the ex-spouse died. And it could be, in your case, like a situation where your stepson is grieving because your partner died. So it's all kind of in this widowed parenting space. It's just kind of different situations and different circumstances that people might find. So a very long way of saying thank you for being here, because I think this is going to be an important discussion. I haven't actually covered this aspect yet on the show. So I'm looking forward to this. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about because it is a different relationship, a different parenting relationship, and it's a complicated one, and it's a complicated one to re-navigate after a loss or a death. Right.
And it's still very much in the space of there's a grieving child or teen involved here, and how do we support them, right?
Yeah.
Which, after all, is a lot of what this show is about. Helping the adults in the lives of grieving kids and teens support them. So let's just jump right in here. And I'd love if you could tell me a little bit about your life before your partner died. Like, what was normal? What was normal life like before everything changed?
Yeah. So we had shared custody. My stepson's name is Connor, and his dad was Dave. And we had shared custody with Connor's mother. And it was a strange schedule. They had a really interesting divorce and interesting shared schedule where it shifted seasonally. So Connor is a ski racer, wonderful skier, and his dad supported that primarily. His dad was really the one who kind of facilitated a lot of the skiing. So in the fall and winter and springtime, we had him more. And in the summertime, his mom had him more, even though they lived close together. So it would be like during that ski season, we had the kid like 80% of the time, right? And we did a lot of traveling together, but we also, for ski racing, but we also just had the normal, you get up, you go to school, kind of situation. And I walked into this, and I'm not a skier. And if you know anything, like if you're a sports parent, that's a interesting thing. And so I'm not a skier, but I became like the ultimate ski stepmom, and I was making food and signed up to be gatekeeper for all the races, which meant I hiked down the mountain and, made sure the kids crossed the gates as they were supposed to, and really kind of immersed myself into this world. Also, he was doing online schooling. So a lot of our life as well was, how do we support a teenager, he was 16, in this online schooling.
Was it online schooling because of COVID or because of the ski schedule?
A little of both. Like, we found it a blessing because of the ski schedule, but and we had talked about doing it prior to COVID, but then COVID happened, so we rolled with it. Yeah,
right.
But we had a fairly normal family life in that way, a normal blended family life. Let's put it like that.
Right. Gotcha. And you mentioned that he was 16.
Yeah. He had just turned 16 the week before his dad died. So we did a lot as a family. We worked well with his mother. Family, we had just had a big family dinner where we had sushi together for Connor's 16th birthday the week before. And Connor actually was on a vacation with his mom. They went for a holiday season right after Thanksgiving to visit her family in Florida. So that was a common vacation that they took in the winter. And my partner and I actually looked forward to this every year because we had a week, like a solid week of just us, which doesn't, you're a parent. That doesn't happen.
Right.
Ever. Right. And then, so he was on vacation with his mom when his dad died. And honestly, I believe that was divinely inspired, that he wasn't there to be there for the death. It was sudden death. Dave had a heart attack and he died in our home. And I have been super grateful. And my stepson has told me he was actually grateful he wasn't there. Did either. Yeah.
How was that for you? That sounds a bit traumatic.
Oh, it was horribly traumatic. Yeah. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. It's definitely, I think, a different type of trauma than a cancer death or something to that effect. I think they both have traumatic aspects, clearly. But it was not expected. He did not have health problems. We had a normal night. We went out for Mexican food, margaritas, came home. And in hindsight, it was classic heart attack. He said, I have indigestion. Where are the Tums? But also, he was a 50-ish year old man, and you eat a bunch of fajitas and drink a margarita, you have indigestion.
Right.
So in hindsight, it was classic heart attack. But yeah, it was pretty traumatic. And, I've not even thought about this until just now, but even me having to call his son. So that was, what I had to do was call his ex-wife and say, hey, I need you to go get Connor.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how was that? Did you tell her first, or did you how did that go? What did you?
So everything kind of went haywire at 11:15 at night.
PM. Okay.
p.m. Yeah, 11:15 p.m. And it was all over and done within like 20 minutes. I mean,
Wow.
I did CPR, the EMS squad came, they went through their entire protocol, and he had died. And so
Wow.
all that was over and done within about 20 minutes. I went to Dave's mother's house to tell her. And then,
So she was nearby somewhere.
yeah, she was nearby within like 2 miles.
Okay.
And so I went to her house to tell her what had happened. And then while I was there at her house, I called Dave's ex-wife, and she was in Florida. And again, it's by that point, it was like 2 a.m. though, because I needed a minute to regroup, and it all just kind of blended together. But I called Dave's ex-wife and said, I need you to go get Connor, and Dave has died, and here's what's happened. And actually, Connor got super upset. So I was still on the phone, and they were at her parents' house, and he left the house. Like he just needed space, and he needed to, but he didn't, in that trauma and in that grief, he just left.
Wow.
And then she got panicked because they were in a strange town, and, her teenage son's running out in the middle of the night. But luckily I called him. I said, well, let me call him. And we hung up the phone, and he and I are close. We've had a different relationship than maybe some step parents and stepkids. And I called him, and he answered the phone, and he said, you can tell my mom I'll be back. I just need a minute. And he said, what happened? And we talked through it. And I mean, it was quick and brief. And then they got in the car and drove back to West Virginia, which was where I was living at the time.
Wow, that sounds incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult and complicated. Like it's a complicated layer within the blended family. Like blended family is always complicated. Even when it's good, it's complicated. And so it did add an extra layer of complication.
Right. Well, and speaking of complication, I wonder if there was any complication. I had read maybe on your website, Dave was your partner and you were Connor's stepmother. And also you guys weren't technically married.
Nope, we were not legally married.
Yeah. So how did that complicate things or not?
Oh my gosh. Well, his ex-wife was very gracious in that she let me handle everything as if I was his wife, like in terms of because I was his partner. We had intended to be together forever. I had been divorced and just didn't want to get married again. I mean, he wanted to get married from the first few months we were together, and I said, absolutely not. And that's a complicated thing of, did I make a mistake in that?
Like in hindsight now, like if you had known that he was going to die, do you wish that?
Would I? Yeah. Should I? But we had many clear conversations, and he knew I was committed. So that was complicated. And part of my choice making and decision making throughout the entire process of planning, the obituary and we didn't have a funeral. We had a small service just at the funeral home immediately. And the celebration of life was really, how does this impact Connor? And how do I make sure Haley, his mom, is included in all of it in the way that is best for him?
Right.
And so there's a bit of a juxtaposition, and we haven't talked about this yet, but I'll go ahead and just say it, and then maybe we can talk more further into the podcast about it. But when my father died, I was 20. And my mom was not looped in, right? She came to the funeral, but she wasn't. She was his ex-wife, and there was nothing really about her in the services or anything like that.
So wait, just for listeners, so you were 20 and your dad at that point was divorced from your mom.
Correct. And had been for many years and remarried.
And married to your stepmother. Okay. And so now your dad died. Okay. And so your own mom was left out or not included somehow. And did that make things harder for you or more complicated for you?
Yeah. Well, because yes, he was my tie to that nuclear family with my stepmom. So it felt like when my dad died that I was ejected from the family from the perspective of a young adult,
Right. Right.
that tie was just gone. So I wanted to be really mindful of that during this process. I don't know how I had the sensibility to do it, honestly,
Yeah.
in the midst of all the grief, but I feel like I did a decent job. First thing was in the obituary, I made sure and included her name. And referred to her as Anne all the surviving people.
Right. And Connor's
Anne's
mother.
mother.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and included her name in that.
Yeah.
And then we had a service just for family. So the service we had just for the family at the funeral home, which actually wasn't even a service, it was just us viewing the body. And that was Dave's mother, Connor, Dave's ex-wife, and myself. And then even at the celebration of life, I had a long talk with the officiant about the way Dave always put his ex-wife kind of in the center of all of it, because we knew the more stable her life was and the better her life was, the better things would be for his son. So I really wanted to continue all that as best I could. I think that seems like a really helpful point for people who are, step parenting, children who've lost their parents. Is as much as it is about you, because you are the one dealing with that loss as the step parent, it was so important to try to put him, his feelings front and center there, so he didn't feel even more and more loss, as if they were isolated. I didn't want him to ever feel like his mother was isolated.
Right.
From what was happening, because it impacted her as well.
Right. Oh, for sure. And it sounds like your own personal experience with this really tuned you into the importance and the sensitivity around some of these issues that might arise.
Yeah. So I basically didn't go home to visit my stepmom or my half sister for years after my dad died. I just didn't feel that I had a place there. I mean, even now, I'm not super close with my dad's family. It was as if that tie was just gone.
I meant to ask, before he died, were you living primarily with them or with your mother or both?
No, I was in college,
Okay.
And he was sick for a couple of years. My dad had leukemia. So while I was in college, it was about every other weekend, I would drive a few hours to the Cleveland clinic where he was having treatments, and we had an apartment there. And the summer before he died, we actually got super close because I took some of that responsibility on of taking him to treatments and things. So I spent that last summer that he was alive doing some of that. So I wasn't living with them. I had been at college for a while, but even when you're in college, you have that connection.
Sure.
You're not a grown adult, even if you feel that you are.
Right. And you might, it's like, where do you go home at Christmas or at, at summer break or whatever, Thanksgiving?
So all that kind of changed for me because my dad was sick. So summer break became like, let's take dad to radiation treatment and have a bone marrow transplant. And that went on for a couple of years of treatments.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so going back to then when Dave died, I wonder if you got any particular advice from anyone. It sounds like you had, maybe I call it internal advice, based on your own experiences. But I wonder if, any particular advice that was particularly helpful or unhelpful, or, experts who were like, you need to do this or not do that.
I actually didn't find much expert advice in this realm, which was really difficult for me. And we had even had I had worked with a step family coach at one point and had been involved, in trying to make sure we did this as well as you can. But I felt very alone in that, nobody wants to hear that this new family you created can implode.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So the step family world was like, oh, great. See you another day, Erin. We don't really want to talk about this, And my personal experience was that, and I didn't understand it, but I had thought, my belief was that my stepmom just didn't want to focus on me or didn't want me in her world. Now, being a widow, what I know is she was just doing what she had to do to get from day to day to day.
Mm-hmm.
She called me just a couple of days after Dave died, and she said, I want you to understand it will always be with you. It will always be bad, but you will learn how to handle it better.
Oh, wait, your stepmother.
My
stepmother who had been widowed to decades before.
Yeah, my stepmother who had been, my stepmother who had been widowed decades before called me. She was my expert.
Okay.
She said, it will always be with you. It will not get better, but you will learn how to handle it in a better way. And so I kind of remembered that throughout the process. But again, I think that internally, I just remember feeling very alone after my dad died, and I didn't want that for my stepson.
Mm-hmm. So how has that been? How have you navigated? I mean, I imagine now he's not living with you during ski season anymore. Well, it's not ski season yet as we're talking, but I imagine things must have changed. How did that unfold?
It changed drastically, and this may even seem controversial. So for the first probably, 6 months, I just doubled down. I wanted him with me as much as possible. I wanted everything to remain as normal as possible. And he, being the 16-year-old boy he was, bucked it with everything in him.
Mm.
And I would drive him to ski practice every weekend. I would come and pick him up from work and take him to tutoring sometimes. But I did not have that same role. He didn't want to be at the house.
Mm.
He would say, don't take it personally. I just don't want to be there.
Because his dad had died in the house, or?
Yeah. And that's what I initially thought.
Mm.
And his mother and I even had conversations. Like, she's like, we can keep custody the same.
Mm.
You can keep him,
Mm.
we can continue this. And then we had conversations about, well, maybe it's the house. And I said, well, I'm not moving until I have a better idea of where I want to be.
Mm.
But then there was a day I picked Connor up from school, and I was sitting in the parking lot, and I was on my cell phone waiting, looking at social media or whatever you do while you're waiting for pickup. And I went to text Dave, and Dave's dead, but it was as normal as anything that I was going to text him about what we were doing for dinner.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just teared up in the car. And so once Connor got in the car, I looked at him and I said, I think I understand now. This is a big, giant reminder of everything wrong in your world. For me to pretend this is normal is like a constant reminder of everything you've lost. He said, yeah, finally you're getting it. And so from that point forward, that was a few months in, I shifted what my intention was. And I went from, I'm going to parent this kid, to I want to be a trusted adult that this kid knows loves him and supports him. And I just want to provide an example for him of how you can live even with the horrible things that life brings you. Yeah.
So that sounds like an important shift and a nuanced shift.
Yeah, it was really difficult. And I moved. I moved far away. I didn't just move down the road. We had many open discussions about it, what that would feel like for him. But I had a clear moment where I realized, as many parents of teens do, I was just sitting and waiting on a teenager to either need a ride somewhere or ask me for money. Right? Because and so there was a closeness that was just very different. And I felt like I was dying on the vine personally. And I thought, I can support this kid better if I show him that life hands you lemons and you can actually make lemonade. And we talked about it. And I said, I need to do this for me personally. I'm going to move. It doesn't mean we aren't going to be close. It doesn't mean we can't have a relationship. It's just going to look different than it does now. And you can always be there I'll always be there for you.
And so was he either open to that or even embracing or, positive about it?
Like, I think it was actually really good because he felt a little bit more free. There was a piece of him that seemed like he was trying to step into like the man of the house role after his dad died. He felt like he needed to take care of me oftentimes. Like he would come in and, put his arm around me. And it was just a moment of, I don't want this kid to become like a surrogate husband or some kind of like, I don't want a weird dynamic to develop here where he feels he needs to take care of me.
Yeah.
And I saw that kind of evolving a bit. So we stopped it. We talked about it because you can say that, but again, he was like, I'm not doing that. What are you talking about? But I could see it evolving.
Right. He might not have even been aware, consciously doing it.
Right. And I just think that's too much for a 16-year-old to try to handle. That's complicated and messy. And I also think 16-year-olds need to know there is someone in their corner, no matter how bad things get or how messy it is. And I don't have the same expectation that his biological parents would have, or the same emotional entanglement.
So what does this look like now? So you live 1,000 or more miles away, I suppose, and he lives with his mother. Or how old is he now? Is he in college now?
No, he's in his last year of high school. He'll be 18 in November. And it looks like FaceTime probably once a week. We FaceTime. It looks like when he has big decisions to make, he will often call me. I'll give you an example. So Dave's dog went to live with his mother. I kept his dog for several months, and then with Dave's mother, Connor's grandmother. And then the dog got sick. He was old and he was sick, and Connor called me one day and said, hey, I need to know what to do about this dog. Like, what do I do? And so it made me realize, this is working. He still trusts me.
Right.
He still knows I'm going to provide him solid advice.
Right.
And so I went into, well, here's what I think your dad would do. This is where I think your father would handle this. And I think that's what he wanted to hear. And he knows that I knew his dad probably better than anybody in the world. So we've built a relationship like that. Nice. I talked to him on the phone yesterday. And he has a new girlfriend that I've only met once. So I'm going to be visiting him and my mother-in-law in the end of September, the end of this month. And he says his girlfriend's looking so forward to spending time with me. Nice. So I can tell that I feel like it's definitely working. It's taken a lot of work on my part, though, because when you're invested in a kid's well-being, it's really hard to try to detach from those outcomes sometimes, from your involvement in them.
Well, and that can be a problem for any parents, right? I mean, think of helicopter parenting, you think of, letting kids, figuring out how to let kids make their own choices and be supportive. It's easier said than done, right?
Right. Oh my gosh, it's so hard. It was one of the biggest challenges, even as a step parent when his dad was alive. It was a hard challenge.
Yeah. Right.
And then, like I said, it was almost as if I was just clinging to every single thing that was. I wanted it to be the same as much as possible until I finally had enough sensibility to realize I needed to let it go.
Yeah, gosh, you're sharing some really insightful and I think important observations and examples with us. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. Yeah, gosh. Well, so what else here? I mean, I guess, do you have any tips for, I mean, that last thing you said, right? Figuring out how to switch your thinking on some of these things.
Yeah, I think that's a big one of switching your mindset of your role has changed, period. If you are a step parent and this child's parent has died, the role has shifted. How do you maintain some sort of a relationship? I mean, unless you don't want to, but if you've been a part of this kid's life, my thoughts are you probably love them. You know, I loved him equally. I loved him separately from his father, still do. And so how do you navigate a relationship there? And the other part that we haven't talked about yet, but is so important, I think, is how do you help keep that memory alive?
Oh yeah, let's talk about that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, and really it just becomes telling stories. So we will just call each other and tell old stories. So for instance, when I started dating Dave, we were at the golf course. I did not know his son, had never met his son. Dave had asked me out on a couple dates and I had said no. We were at the golf course. There's a buffet. The last helping of dessert was on the buffet. And this cute little kid runs up and he goes to get the last helping of dessert. And he says, "Oh, ma'am, this is the last one. You can have it."
Oh.
And I looked at him. I was like, no, take the cobbler. You're good. And then I realized whose kid it was. And I decided to go out with his father after that. Because I thought, okay, well, if he can raise a kid who has manners, and maybe I'll give him a shot.
Yeah.
So we joked about that because
and he remembers that.
Yeah. So he called me one day. He said, "You know what? I just think my dad was really lucky he had me in his life." So we try to just tell those old stories, remember those old things. Actually, I need to work on this right now, but I have a bunch of old T-shirts that are being made into a quilt, like a memorial quilt that I'll honor.
Nice.
So just those little things, reaching out on the birthdays, reaching out on those dates. And I do think that is absolutely the job of the step parent. Even if you're the widow, even if you're grieving, you are the adult. And so I do think, like, even in the midst of all that hard grief, that's your job. If you want to maintain a relationship with this child, you can't expect them to do it. They have no clue how to do that.
So when it's Dave's birthday or death anniversary or a holiday or something important, you call him, text him, something like that. Like, I'm thinking about you today.
Yep. And it works. Sometimes he'll send me random videos of his dad or, just memories of us. And I think it'll be different when he's older. When he's 30 years old, he may have a very different perspective. But I definitely think that is the job. Even as you shift your perspective and shift your role, it is still your job to be maybe the initiator. I just don't think the children have the capacity necessarily. They're trying to manage a whole lot of grief. We all are, but it's different.
Sure. Plus, well, also the younger they are, they tend to be more absorbed in their own world anyway and not thinking, of somebody else's perspective or whatever. Right. So, yeah.
So that's another tip. Keep those memories alive as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, this discussion has been full of all kinds of great. What haven't we covered yet that you'd like to mention or that I should have asked you about?
I think that's all.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we've hit on a lot. It's definitely a different topic than.
Yeah. No, but this is great. And like I said, this podcast is all about supporting parents defined as people who are in that parenting role, supporting grieving children. And so I think it's really great to hear your perspective and your experience on this and the tips and perspective that you're sharing. Right. And I'd encourage listeners to maybe listen to it more than once, share it with somebody that, maybe if it doesn't apply to, if you're listening and maybe you know somebody else that this would apply to. Who would find it interesting. Oh, good. Well, this is so good. I'm glad we've had this discussion here.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I always like to ask one kind of wrap-up question, and it may be a recap of something you said, but to leave people on, if you could say one thing to step-parents of grieving children, what would you say to them?
One thing to step-parents of grieving children. I think the biggest thing is to continue to foster your love for that child and your relationship with that child separately than the parent. And so when you're in the middle of blended family life, that tends to become a family unit. And so if you're listening to this and you're in a blended family and you still have the alive spouse, start facilitating that relationship now. But even more importantly, just to recognize that this kid is in your life and you love them separately than their parent. And that doesn't need to change. In fact, I think it can grow, and you can be a person that they can look to for support differently than a parent, an actual biological parent throughout their lifetime.
Yeah. Terrific. Okay. Well, thank you. And actually, I forgot to ask you, I think you may be working on a book of some sort. Can you tell us, is that, when can we read it?
I don't know when you can read it yet, but stay tuned. I am working on a book, and the entire essence of the book is going to be, yes, we have grief. So this widowdom brings a myriad of problems, but how do we really live as fully as possible, even when the grief and the loss happens? It changed my life in a way that I live very, very differently than I did before. Much more joyfully and much more in the moment and much more freely, I think. And I wanted to model that for Connor, that even as life brings you adversity, you can always show back up. You can always show back up and have a loving and joyful life. So that's the book. And stick with me because you'll see when it comes out.
Yeah. Well, terrific. Good. We will look forward to that sometime in the future. Keep me posted. Okay. And be sure to share a link for folks who want to check that out sometime down the road. But in the meantime, this has been such a great discussion. Erin, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Erin Browning as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 127. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening, and until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.